Denise Gwen, reading aloud for you from my novel, His Christmas Eve Proposal. Book 3 in the Medicine Women of Alaska, Chapter 27. Naomi sat in a room that looked vaguely familiar. After a long moment of scrutinizing the room, it connected with her. And then she recognized it as the vestry from her church growing up in Los Angeles. She wore a beautiful wedding gown and a veil. It wasn't the Cinderella ball gown she'd worn for her aborted wedding to Ricardo. Rather, it was a silk, sexy lingerie-style slip dress that hugged her curves in all the right places. Oh, how she regretted giving up the slinky slip dress. She'd tried this dress on first at the bridal salon and fallen in love with it instantly. She'd felt feminine and pretty and downright sexy. But her soon-to-be mother-in-law, Marlena Velasquez, reacted with horror when she saw it and shooed Naomi back to the dressing room to try on a more appropriate fairy tale type wedding gown. If it'd been only her mother-in-law's opinion, she would have stood her ground. But Ricardo had been present as well, making Naomi feel like a prize heifer on display at the county fair. And when he saw the dress his mother picked out, he cried out his approval. "That dress is perfect, Naomi. It captures you perfectly." Yes, in frothing layers of tulle. And so she'd said yes, reluctantly, to the dress. On their way back to the penthouse apartment in the chauffeured town car, Ricardo took her hand and squeezed it. "The first gown that you tried on was lovely, my darling, but more suitable for a bedroom than a wedding. You'll be more comfortable in the one that my mother and you picked." Only she hadn't picked out the gown that he ended up buying for her. She'd gone along with the gown that he and his mother had chosen. In that moment, a tingling sensation of unease assailed her, and she began to wonder if she was making the right decision in marrying this man. Perhaps she'd made a terrible mistake. Perhaps she'd never marry again. Perhaps she ought to have put her fears and concerns aside and married Ricardo. But whenever she was overcome with regrets, she recalled the crushing pain of Jackson's death. No, every time she assailed herself with guilt over Ricardo, she reminded herself that all she'd done was leave him at the altar. Yes, it'd been emotionally draining and the press coverage had been humiliating, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had compared to the grief she'd experienced following Jackson's death. And now she had no idea if she'd saved Ricardo's life. Hopefully, she'd performed the procedure properly. But at this very moment, she didn't know, and a terrible dread filled her heart. When Hermano Velasquez discovered that the woman who'd broken his son's heart had been trying to save it on a mountainside and failed, oh, there'd be repercussions for sure. She might lose her medical license. And then she recalled something that she'd blocked out completely until this moment. Ricardo opened his eyes as she inserted the chest tube. He stared vacantly at her. Then his brown eyes widened. He'd recognized her. A jolt of terror thrilled down her spine at the realization that he'd not only recognized her, but remembered the heartache she'd given him. Yes, she was definitely turning in her medical license. And she could say goodbye to Gnometown, Alaska, and to all that it represented, and to all the people she'd come to love in just the short time she'd spent here. She loved it here. She loved a man here. She opened her eyes and looked around the unfamiliar room. She couldn't quite place the room she was in, but she knew it wasn't her bedroom. She glanced to her right, and the time on the digital alarm clock read 2:00 in the morning. She sensed she'd been sleeping for a long time, and she hadn't realized just how long. But the number on the clock revealed all. She crept out of bed, looking around the cozy bedroom, searching for clues. But she didn't see a single thing to reorient her. And then she padded over to the window and gazed out and realized where she was. She saw the lake shimmering below her. Drew put me to bed. This must be his bed. Instant panic rose in Naomi's throat, and she hurried around the bedroom searching for her clothes. She had to get out of here, stat. She found her boots hidden under the bed, pulled them on, dragged on the fleece parka he'd loaned her, and found her mittens. Only as she looked around frantically, where'd he put her handbag? She opened the bedroom door and reoriented herself as she stepped into the great room. She took a few more steps forward and stood in the kitchen. And over there, where she'd enjoyed a sumptuous home-cooked meal in front of a roaring fire, she saw the object of her affection. He was stretched out on the sofa, asleep. A few smoldering embers crackled in the fireplace. What a good, decent man. He'd spent the night out here. He didn't even attempt to share the bed with her, even though she wouldn't mind it at all if he had. Oh, there's my handbag, perched on the kitchen counter. She hadn't driven here. This whole day had started, 18 hours ago? Jeezle Pete's, had that much time passed since he picked her up in his truck outside of her practice when he offered to take her on a hike around the park? You could call a cab. Yes, a cab. Yes, that was it, a cab. She'd call a cab and scuttle on out of here. She reached into her handbag, found her cell phone, and pulled it out. It'd lost a lot of power, but it still had 30% and full internet access. More than enough for her to call a cab and get out of Drew's way before he awoke. She didn't care to explore why she wanted to flee before he awoke. She crept past him, and as she did so, she simply could not resist the temptation. She gazed down at him and her heart softened. He was so handsome, lying there, fast asleep. For goodness sakes, it was a Sunday morning. She would have loved nothing more than to wake him up and admit her feelings for him in an outpouring of emotion and tears, but an inner part of her rejected that idea. She'd already destroyed one good man's peace of mind. She needed to get out of here and leave this good, decent man alone. But she hesitated, torn. She longed to curl up on the sofa beside him and perhaps turn on the television and spend this Sunday vegging out and relaxing like a normal person. Because isn't that what normal people did? They relaxed and spent time with their loved ones. Ha! She didn't want to admit to this. She'd already sensed that Drew was a far different man than Ricardo. For one thing, Drew didn't care one whit for fame. He lived a quiet life far away from the public eye. And yet there were other, more telling ways in which Drew differed from Ricardo, and she found that she preferred Drew's ways to Ricardo's. She couldn't run the risk of hurting yet another man. Yes, but Drew is a completely different person, and he shares more of your deep beliefs than Ricardo ever did. Drew wouldn't be the least bit interested in helping her to choose a wedding dress. She snorted with laughter at the thought of it. He was the kind of guy who'd be down with whatever she loved, not what he felt was best for his reputation or concerned over how her gown might appear in the newspapers. And then she realized a far more bitter truth. I don't deserve Drew. I don't deserve Drew. She fetched a heavy sigh. No matter what decision she made, her love life had to take a back seat to her plans. She clicked on her cell phone and scrolled through the Yellow Pages listing for Gnometown cabs. She called the service, clicked off. She walked to the front door and put her hand on the doorknob.